From every direction, Gelmet Academy hoverpods sped along the intercity hover strips towards Lawton. The gleaming black pods raced into the city high above the old town, which stood, like the town in every other city, abandoned, empty, windowless and derelict. They whizzed through the new town, between its tall glass buildings and under the metal sky bridges that connected the towers high in the air. On they went, heading for a hill in the forest beyond the new town, then onto a hover slip that wound upwards through the trees and ended at a lush green lawn. A few minutes before 4 o'clock, the first of the hoverpods shot out of the forest, sped across the lawn and came to a halt, hovering in front of a glistening white building. 10 seconds later, a second pod came hurtling out of the forest. 10 seconds more, and a third pod appeared. Every 10 seconds for 5 minutes, a new pod streaked across the lawn. By 4 o'clock, 30 identical hoverpods levitated in a line. They dropped to the ground. The doors opened. "Welcome," said a voice. "Please get out." 30 children got out of the hoverpods. The air at the top of the hill was cool and fresh. Some jumped out quickly. Some emerged casually, poking their heads out and glancing from side to side first. They recognised the white building from the picture that each of them had already seen. They looked around, at the building, at the grounds, at the line of hoverpods, at each other. They were as different as any group of 30 children can be. Some tall, some short, some dark, some blonde, some narrow, some broad, some grinning, some frowning. They were standing in front of a broad set of steps that led up to a grand entrance. Above the entrance was a huge block of pale stone in which were incised the words that none of the children had seen before the previous day, but which suddenly seemed to be everywhere. "Excellence brooks no delay! Leadership knows no obstacle!" And below the words, at the top of the steps and in front of the entrance itself, stood a man. He was a short, slim man in his 50s, with closely cropped grey hair and very pale blue eyes. He was dressed in a plain purple suit. The jacket had a round collar and was buttoned all the way up to his neck, the only adornment on it were the letters G.A. embroidered in orange on the chest. For a moment the man stood silently, surveying the children who had got out of the hoverpods. Soon, very soon, their eyes were focused on him. "Welcome," said the man again. His voice rang out loudly around the building and the grounds. "How wonderful it is to see you all. Please get your belongings." The luggage doors of the hoverpods slid open. The children took out their bags. Come closer," said the man, beckoning them. The children came closer until they were all standing at the foot of the steps. Behind them, the luggage doors of the hoverpods slid shut.
"Good," said the man. He stopped to look at them all again. "Well, I suppose you're wondering who I am. Let me tell you. I am Professor Alphonse B. Gelmet. The building you see behind you is my academy, and you, each one of you, have been chosen to study here." Professor Gelmet nodded. "Yes, each one of you. Congratulations." Some of the children smiled. "Come," said Professor Gelmet. "I'll explain." The professor turned. He took a couple of steps towards the door. Then he looked back. No one had moved. "Come," he said. "Excellence brooks no delay. Leadership—" He waited, cupping one hand to his ear. "Leadership?" he repeated, pointing to the words incised in the stone above his head. "Knows no obstacle?" suggested a few of the children doubtfully. "Exactly! Everybody! Excellence!" "Brooks no delay," mumbled the children, feeling somewhat foolish. "Louder!" cried the professor. "All together! Excellence!" "Brooks no delay," said the children. The professor cupped his hand behind his ear again. "Excellence! Brooks no delay!" cried the children. Professor Gelmet smiled. "And leadership knows no obstacle!" the children yelled at the tops of their voices, and they found themselves grinning and laughing at each other. "Exactly," said Professor Gelmet as he turned again and went into the building. The professor was leading them down a high, marble-lined corridor. The noise of their footsteps echoed off the walls.
Eventually, the professor turned into a doorway and took them into a large room with tall windows overlooking the lawn. Chairs were set out in the room. "Please sit down," said the professor, and he watched as each child found a place. Will took a seat in the third row. "Good," said the professor when everyone was settled. First, I would like to thank each of you for coming. I realise that some of you may have found it rather rushed, but time is short. Time is always short for those of us who wish to achieve important things. That is something you will come to understand here. The professor paused, as if pondering very carefully what he was going to say next. When he went on, his tone was quiet and serious. Each of you have been carefully chosen to join the academy. There is a good reason that each one of you have been selected. For the moment, those reasons remain confidential. It's only natural that you will try to work out what they are. Perhaps you will succeed, but I doubt it. Let me assure you, if you do think you've worked it out, you're probably wrong, so I would advise you not to spend too much of your time on that. Will glanced at the others. He could see everyone else glancing around as well, sizing each other up, trying to work out what the reasons might be. So was he, as a matter of fact. At this academy, continued the professor, you will be taught in a way that is totally new. In the past, many educators have claimed that their methods are revolutionary. In almost all cases, they have exaggerated. I do not exaggerate. When I say that my method of teaching is totally new, that is what it is. Totally new. You will be the first class, the very first group to receive instruction in this way. What you will experience has never been experienced before. The professor paused, looking slowly around the room until he had looked into the eyes of each of the 30 children. You will learn at 5 times the speed that you have learned until now. You will remember 5 times as much of what you learn and become 5 times as effective in applying it. In short, you will become smarter, sharper, slicker, quicker, and more capable than you ever could have imagined. But that isn't the most amazing thing. Far from it. Would you like to know what the most amazing thing is? The professor raised an eyebrow, and just the hint of a smile played across his lips. The silence in the room was complete. Every eye was turned on the professor, every breath held, waiting for him to continue. You will learn all of this, said the professor, without doing a single hour's work. There were gasps around the room. Yes, not a single hour's work, not a single hour's study. For years this has been my dream. At last the dream is a reality. The professor nodded. The children began to smile. They laughed. No work, not a single hour's study. It wasn't only the professor's dream, it was their dream as well. In fact, had there ever been a child whose dream it wasn't? Will caught the eye of a girl sitting a couple of seats away, and they grinned at each other. The professor raised his hands, asking for silence. With this knowledge, he continued when the noise had died down, you will become leaders of the community. Whether in business, politics, the military, or public service, this is your destiny. Enter these walls, and this is your future. Here at the Gelmet Academy, we do not have students, we do not have pupils, we have leaders. There was no laughter now. The young faces watching the professor were serious again. All I ask is that you do as I tell you. Does that sound fair? The children nodded, or shrugged, or frowned. It did sound fair, thought Will, as fair as it could be, considering that the professor hadn't yet said what he wanted them to do. The professor smiled. I'm sure you're curious to know more. Well, tomorrow, leaders, we begin in earnest. Then you will understand what I have been saying. For today, I think this is enough. Now, before I leave you, I would like to introduce to you the other members of our staff. A panel in the wall behind the professor slid open. 3 people entered the room. One was a woman with short, dark hair, dressed in a crisp purple suit like the one that Professor Gelmet was wearing. Following her was a tall, powerful man with a fully shaven head, dressed in a similar suit, but green instead of purple. He took his place in front of the children and stood perfectly straight and still, his jaw raised. The third person was an old man with fluffy white hair that stood up in tufts on either side of his head. His suit was brown. He twitched and blinked and looked around curiously at the children from the moment he came in. While you are in the academy, said the professor, you will see very little of me. Everything will be done under my direct supervision, of course, but these are the people who will guide you in your time here. Each one is an expert in his or her field. They will get to know you, leaders. Try to get to know them as well. You have much to gain from each of them. The first 2 people nodded seriously. The old man looked around, blinked, and smiled encouragingly. "First, let me present Dr. Gertrude Fugg," said the professor, gesturing towards the woman. "Dr. Fugg is the academic supervisor and will ensure that your studies progress satisfactorily." "Welcome, leaders," said Dr. Fugg. "We will get to know each other well." "But the academy is not only about studies," said the professor. "Here you will find the facilities for almost every sport and activity. They are provided for your enjoyment, leaders. Make use of them." The professor held out his hand toward the man in the green suit. "This gentleman is here to help you in this. He is Master Athlete Henrik Targ, a gold medalist in the 400-meter relay. He is also a Submaster Class 2 of Pointy Wibblers." Henrik Targ nodded briskly. "Welcome, leaders." "And finally," said the professor, "Mr. Barnaby Krantz, the general housekeeper." Mr. Krantz smiled at the children once more. "Welcome, children," he said jovially. "Leaders," whispered Professor Gelmet. "Sorry, leaders, of course. Silly of me. Welcome, leaders," he said to the children, waving a finger in the air. There were giggles. Mr. Krantz beamed in response. Dr. Fugg and Henrik Targ watched him disapprovingly. "So, leaders, welcome once more," said the professor. "Mr. Krantz will show you to your rooms. This afternoon, take the time to settle in. Introduce yourselves. You are all new to each other. Not one of you knows anyone else yet. You will each make many friends. You will have much to look forward to. Much, much to look forward to." The professor nodded. Then his voice became lower, his gaze more searching. "Remember, leaders, our work here is serious. Tomorrow we begin." And with that the professor turned and left the room. Dr. Fugg and Henrik Targ followed him out. The panel closed behind them. Only Barnaby Krantz remained. He gazed at the children, scratching his head through one of the white tufts of his hair. The children gazed back at him. "Well, I suppose I better show you to your rooms," said Mr. Krantz after a moment. "And you'll be wanting something to eat at some stage, won't you?" The children nodded. One or two muttered that they definitely would be wanting something to eat, and sooner rather than later. "Yes," murmured Mr. Krantz, "children always do."
Thanks for joining us for another episode of From the Bookshelf. Please make sure you do like and subscribe so you don't miss any chapters of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet. See you next time.